The third painting in the Air Force Medallion second editions is the Lancaster. I think there would have been problems if we hadn't put the Lancaster into this series, because people have such a connection to this aircraft through whether it's relatives that flew the aircraft during the war, or just the amazing shape and sound that the Lancaster has. And this really was one I was looking forward to, because World War II aircraft is my main interest when I'm doing aviation art, but also a lot more in the historical scenes. It gives me a chance to maybe play around with that fantasy element I was talking about previously about the Hercules. Because you're recreating a historic scene, you can put a certain level of artistic license into it. It still has to have a sense of reality to it, but it's nice to have a bit more of a play around with those aspects. So that was an interesting one to approach the Lancaster. Where to start with the Lancaster? It was flown by so many crews during the Second World War. Australians have a real connection to it as well, through either flying with the Royal Air Force or in Australian squadrons as well. But really, with discussions we had at BrandNet, it was pretty obvious that it was going to be G for George, which is the Lancaster, which is at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Because people have that connection to that aircraft as well. It's one of those popular exhibits in Australia. So that really was the starting point to work with. Again, I did want to show a fairly typical scene, but the typical scene of a Lancaster was night bombing. So it gave me lots of different options to work with. And I guess it's a little bit similar to the painting that's actually behind me. This was the Canberra bomber painting Night Spectres from the first edition medallions. That's a night scene over Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And you can see, as soon as you go to a nighttime scene, it gives you a lot of atmosphere to play around with. And Lancasters, they flew night missions over enemy territory. So they're always being intercepted by anti-aircraft fire, enemy fighters, there were searchlights. There were so many dangers involved with that type of operation, but it does give you a great sense of atmosphere to work with, which I was really looking forward to. So my initial concepts, I just developed the night scene. Even at that stage, there wasn't really thought about which aircraft it was going to be, but I started to develop an idea, and I guess work a little more on the abstract idea with the searchlights in the background. I paint lots of different things, and as much as I enjoy realism, painting realism and aviation art, I also enjoy more abstract expressionist approaches, and this gave me an opportunity to bring some of that element into this painting. So the idea of those searchlights, I haven't seen in reality, but I have seen nighttime light shows and scenes in documentaries or movies where you get a sense of that light really sort of cutting through the sky in sharp detail. So I was working on that element, and I also wanted to tell a bit of the story about how these bomber crews were faced with so many dangers. I wanted to include some of the anti-aircraft fire, but I guess display some of that terror that maybe the crews were experiencing during those missions. So the scene is over a city at night that's being bombed. The searchlights are up in the sky, and eventually I integrated an aircraft in the background, which was actually it's being coned by the searchlights, which was a tactic they used where the searchlights would hone in on a single aircraft and then focus all their fire on it. So I wanted to include an element of that in the background. The original designs, I was playing with some different colours because that's what nighttime scenes allowed you to do. There's so many different forms of light coming through, And the original idea was actually quite bluey and purpley, and the aircraft were all flying from left to right, which is actually opposite to how it appears on the final version. And with the discussions we had with the design team, someone mentioned the fact that it actually looked colour-wise very similar to the Centenary of Air Force painting from earlier in the year, the blues and the purples. So there's a chance to maybe steer away from that a little bit. So that's where the colour palette changed a fair bit. I tried a couple of different options and eventually went with a really sort of fiery, orangey type of sky, which allowed me to, in the shadow areas, work a bit more on a contrast of colour. So there's a bit of green and blue coming into the aircraft in the shadow areas. So that was a nice contrast of colour to work with. Once the aircraft was decided G for George, well, one of the identifying features of G for George is the tally board, which is actually on the port side of the aircraft, the left side, just below the cockpit. And that's why I spun the composition around the other way, just so even though it's a small painting and you probably won't see it on the medallions, that tally board is actually, fairly significant to that aircraft. In terms of the mission, I was really thinking to show that ferocity in that scene with the fire and the explosions below. It had to be a fairly, dire sort of situation. And I thought, well, Berlin was generally that sort of target for the bomber crews during the war. It was one of the furthest the most heavily defended target. And I thought that tied in nicely with the idea. So I checked the actual record for G for George. It flew to Berlin on several missions by different crews as well. But I'm pretty sure this one, I can't remember the crew's name off the top of my head, but the one that I chose was around the midpoint of its career. So it survived 90 missions in total, which is the second highest number of missions flown by any Lancaster that survived. So I think it was around the 50th mission, around September in 1943, that the 460 Squadron, the Australian Lancaster Squadron, was one of the units that was sent to Berlin on that night. And I thought that was a nice sort of tie-in to that aircraft. As I was researching it, I actually found an amazing, it's a recreation of a bombing scene based on actual audio from a mission. And it just happened that that particular mission that the audio came from was this exact same mission that I put in the painting. So it gave me a real sense of what the crews went through and trying to translate some of that into the painting that you see before with the medallion. So again, I hope that those people that have connection to the Lancaster can appreciate through this artwork what a lot of Australians went through during the Second World War, and also other crews that flew Lancasters and bombers at night.